Inspector Purbright first encountered the matter not as a death, but as a question, spoken with the sort of imprudent candour usually reserved for strangers in railway compartments. It came to his attention during a mid-morning call at the vicarage, where Mrs. Weatherby received him with the polite attentiveness expected of someone who has spent her life managing committees and suppressing minor scandals. She served tea in thin porcelain cups that rattled audibly against their saucers, each motion meticulous, each pause considered. Her account of the incident at the St. Mildred's Ladies' Fellowship meeting was delivered with a conscientious vagueness. She refrained from quoting the offending words, as if their repetition might summon a moral lightning bolt. "Someone raised an unfortunate question," she said, dabbing at the rim of her cup with a linen napkin, "concerning Miss Harcourt's charitable intentions and perhaps the recent adjustments to her will. Naturally, we did not, how shall I put it, encourage the matter to continue." Purbright noted the way her eyes flicked toward the small embroidered clock on the mantelpiece, a silent summons to decorum, as though the inanimate objects themselves were arbiters of propriety. The question, Mrs. Weatherby continued, had arisen over seed cake, which Purbright recognized as a detail no less significant than the words themselves. Seed cake, she implied, demanded civility, and civility had been violated. The room, once the stage for convivial chatter about flower shows and parish bazaars, had fallen into a silence of precisely the kind that leaves a subtle mark, the sort of pause that registers more insistently than speech, settling into the conscience of each listener. Miss Celia Harcourt, Mrs. Weatherby added with faint regret, had passed away 2 days later, entirely naturally, of causes unremarkable in medical accounts, yet entirely extraordinary in the narrative life of the village. There had been no scandal, no public disturbance, yet the question persisted in whispered rumour and hesitant glances. Purbright listened, taking notes on the subtlest cues, the slight tightening of Mrs. Weatherby's lips when mentioning the fellowship, the gentle, almost imperceptible shiver in the curtains from a draught left unattended, as if even the house itself recoiled at impropriety. "Do you know," Mrs. Weatherby said finally, "who asked the question?" Purbright inclined his head. "I have not yet ascertained. She has, of course, been gone for some days," Mrs. Weatherby said, "and yet, curiously, no one remembers exactly who spoke. It is as though the village collectively decided the words were best forgotten for fear, perhaps, of repercussions." The inspector made a faint note. Fear of repercussions is seldom absent in a village that prizes its appearances above its facts. Here, reputation operates as a form of currency, spent and hoarded with equal discretion. Later, over a brief walk in the vicarage garden, Purbright observed the parish newsletter pinned against a wooden fence by a single, tentative pin. Its contents were predictable, yet telling in what was omitted. Miss Harcourt's death received a paragraph of courteous commendation. Her generosity was extolled, her modesty noted, her contributions commemorated with all the florid respect the editor could muster. And yet, afternoon tea, the ill-fated question, the momentary disturbance of the fellowship's harmony, vanished entirely. Purbright considered that such omissions often speak more clearly than what is printed. Returning indoors, he found Mrs. Weatherby fussing over the final arrangement of her afternoon post, letters stacked with the exactitude of someone accustomed to ensuring that each communication preserved both content and propriety. Among them, Purbright noticed a folded note addressed to Miss Harcourt, bearing no postage mark. The handwriting was familiar, sharp, meticulous, formally courteous. It was a query of sorts, inquiring whether Miss Harcourt's new dispositions were final. It spoke nothing of malice, yet it carried the faintest edge of challenge. Purbright filed this quietly in memory, as the most promising lead often arrives unheralded, disguised in domestic ritual. By the time the inspector left the vicarage, the tea had long grown lukewarm. The silence that had accompanied its consumption lingered in his mind, not for its volume, but for its insistence. He understood that the question's danger lay not in any breach of law or moral duty, but in its capacity to expose assumption, the assumption that Miss Harcourt's beneficence was permanent, unquestioned, and unquestionable. Even as he walked through the neatly trimmed hedges of the village square, past the hardware shop with its sign proclaiming "Trust in Service," Purbright observed the subtle ways in which a community disciplines itself. Conversations avoided certain subjects, glances passed like polite interrogations, hands were shaken, but not too firmly. Everyone behaved as if a misstep might unravel an invisible lattice of social expectation. For all its outward calm, the village contained a latent attentiveness, a readiness to register what is never spoken aloud. Purbright, who had spent a career reading such silences, recognized the peculiar thrill and peril of a question nobody repeats. It had already begun to shape conduct, dictate conversation, and delineate the boundaries of polite curiosity. And at the edge of his consciousness he discerned the faintest indication of a clue, a slight inconsistency in Mrs. Weatherby's narrative, a hesitation over the sequence of events, a detail she did not know she had betrayed. It was nearly imperceptible, yet it promised the sort of revelation that only patience and observation could unfold. Purbright straightened his coat and adjusted his hat, thinking that the case, though outwardly simple, would require the quietest scrutiny. One question, he reflected, need not be answered to exert influence. The village, already disturbed by its echo, had begun to rearrange itself around absence and omission. And so the inspector walked on, leaving behind teacups, polite smiles, and a silence pregnant with unspoken truths. Inspector Purbright approached Miss Harcourt's house with the calm precision of a man entering a museum rather than a residence. The garden gate squeaked once, politely, as though to announce his intrusion without offence, and the gravel path crunched in careful rhythm beneath his shoes. Inside he found the parish secretary, Mrs. Linton, at the escritoire, perched behind a neat stack of letters that were, in their way, more revealing than any spoken testimony. She looked up with a mild, professionally rehearsed surprise. "Inspector," she said, "I was not expecting you. Perhaps there is something you require?" Purbright inclined his head, noting the carefully neutral tone, the slight contraction of her eyebrows that suggested alertness rather than alarm. "I hope to examine any correspondence Miss Harcourt received recently. Condolences, drafts, anything that might indicate her last concerns." Mrs. Linton hesitated, then produced a bundle tied with blue ribbon, each envelope marked in the delicate handwriting of parish acquaintances. She handed him the first few letters, each brimming with the standard vocabulary of polite sorrow. "Heartfelt sympathy, esteem, ever in our prayers." Nothing unusual, except for the faintly accusatory phrasing in one, gently hinting at a misunderstanding regarding charitable bequests. Purbright paused, allowing the implication to settle in the room like dust. "And were these sent?" he asked, tapping the envelope lightly. "They were for the most part," Mrs. Linton replied, lowering her voice in a curious mixture of propriety and confession. "Though some drafts, not all were dispatched. Miss Harcourt seemed reluctant. I cannot explain her reasoning. One might say she found certain expressions unnecessary, or perhaps she wished to avoid embarrassment, or possibly—" She trailed off, pinching the bridge of her nose with a gesture that suggested she had offered too much, then withdrew the motion with the grace of someone accustomed to maintaining balance in social negotiations. Purbright made a note. The contradiction was not accidental, it was habitual, a pattern familiar to him in the microcosmic politics of small towns. Later he was ushered to the rectory, where the committee members of St. Mildred's Ladies' Fellowship had convened, eager to speak in measured tones. Tea was served not for refreshment, but as a framework in which conversation could unfold with ceremonial civility. The inspector sat back observing the subtle choreography of posture, cup placement, and inflection. "Celia," began Mrs. Appleton, the treasurer, was, of course, exemplary in her discretion. One could never doubt her judgment. She was always most judicious. "Indeed," said Miss Carrington, correcting Mrs. Appleton without rancour. "Judicious, yes, but one must not overlook her fortitude, particularly when managing the committee's financial affairs." Purbright noted the way each woman's phrasing shaped the past to suit the present, each virtue highlighted in accordance with communal expectations. A single misstep in recollection could imply impropriety, and impropriety was here a silent contagion. The fatal question, the one that had haunted the fellowship over tea, was mentioned only obliquely. "An unfortunate remark was made," Mrs. Appleton said, glancing at the others for validation. "But it matters little. One cannot dwell on such trifles." "Certainly," Miss Carrington agreed, her smile faintly corrective. "What matters is her character, preserved now in memory and action." Purbright, unmoved by these courteous deflections, observed the underlying negotiations, the subtle corrections, the shared insistence on unanimity, the avoidance of attribution. Reputation, he noted, was treated as communal property, maintained less by law than by tacit, almost ritualized consent. One could not mention a question aloud without disrupting the lattice of social expectation that had been delicately erected over decades. A servant brought more tea, and as the cup rattled lightly against its saucer, Purbright's attention wandered to a corner where a single folded note lay unopened, set aside on a chair as if inadvertently forgotten. He asked Mrs. Linton about it, and she explained with a faint blush that it was unsent, a private inquiry from Miss Harcourt herself, questioning a perceived misunderstanding regarding the allocation of certain funds. It was brief, careful, and contained no accusation, only a quiet insistence that her intentions be respected. Purbright filed the observation quietly. The note was, in a sense, a minor rebellion, a disruption of consensus, though expressed with impeccable civility. In a village that prized appearance over scrutiny, even gentle dissent could provoke subtle anxiety. Before leaving, he lingered to observe the committee members arranging themselves for a group photograph, ostensibly to commemorate Miss Harcourt's contributions. Each posture, each tilt of the head, spoke of a communal desire to present harmony. Yet, in the synchronized smiles and careful alignment, Purbright detected a hesitation, a shadow in the eyes that betrayed consciousness of the unspoken question. Walking home through the narrow streets of the village, he considered the letters, the tea-room confessions, and the unsent note. Each was a fragment of an invisible architecture, a lattice of expectation, politeness, and self-restraint. In such an environment, silence wielded authority equal to speech. The question, though muted, had already begun to shape behavior and thought. And at the edge of his observation, Purbright detected something slight, almost imperceptible. A committee member, Mrs. Appleton, adjusting the ribbon on her note bundle with a tremor of precision, as if ensuring that what must be hidden remained hidden. It was a gesture without sound, but laden with significance, a quiet acknowledgement that some matters, though mentioned, must remain unresolved. The inspector's notebook received this detail with the calm attention of a man who knew the weight of subtleties. In the village, he reflected, consensus was preserved less through agreement than through carefully orchestrated oversight, a collective policing of memory and propriety. and in that oversight perhaps lay the first true clue. Purbright straightened his coat, pocketed his notebook, and left the rectory with the sense that the case was already dictating its own terms, that the silent anxiety of a community might prove more telling than any confession or testimony. One note, unsent but preserved, one tremor of the hand, and a question still unspoken. The smallest disturbances, he knew, often presaged the most revealing truths. The parish council met on a Wednesday evening, in a room warmed by the faintly institutional glow of gas lamps and the soft, omnipresent smell of polished wood. Inspector Purbright arrived shortly after 7, noticing that the councillors had already arranged themselves according to unspoken hierarchies, the chairman at the head, the secretary fidgeting with her notes, and the rest occupying their habitual chairs, their posture calibrated between attentiveness and tolerance. Each face suggested readiness to perform civility and, where necessary, to conceal irritation beneath a veneer of polite conformity. Purbright had observed many such gatherings, and he knew their peculiar rhythm, the management of minor anxieties through rigid procedural formality. The agenda displayed on a wall-mounted board moved from mundane approvals to missives from distant diocesan offices, none of which bore any hint of scandal. Order was preserved less through discussion than through habitual acknowledgement of the items in sequence, each councillor aware that even a slight deviation might provoke unintended discomfort. Miss Harcourt's name appeared only under the heading Legacy Matters. Discussion, when it arrived, was brisk, unusually precise, and oddly defensive. Councillor Pearson, whose voice was usually measured to the point of monotony, moved a motion to allocate funds for the repair of the church roof. As it was Miss Harcourt's wish, he added, glancing at the chairman, and naturally what she would have wanted. Purbright inclined his head, mildly interested. "And may I inquire how such certainty is obtained?" he asked. "Given that there were, reportedly, some recent revisions." The chairman, a thin man with wire spectacles perched at the tip of his nose, coughed delicately before replying. "Questions of intention," he said, "are, at this juncture, unhelpful. We proceed with decorum, Inspector, and with regard for established precedent." A faint murmur of agreement ran through the room, though it was indistinct enough to be interpreted as polite assent. A councillor cleared her throat, conspicuously adjusting the wording of the minutes before they had been committed to paper. Another tapped the agenda with deliberate fingers, as if reminding himself that procedure was more important than speculation. Purbright made a careful note. The real work of the council was rarely the passage of motions. It was the subtle policing of memory, the quiet correction of phrasing, the invisible choreography by which discomfort was contained. Every interruption, cough, or minor adjustment served to remind the others of what was acceptable and what, despite polite acknowledgement, was better left unexamined. After the meeting, Purbright lingered near the door, observing the councillors as they departed. One, Mrs. Ellsworth, a tall woman with a rigid posture and a faintly frosted expression, leaned toward him. "No impropriety, Inspector," she said, as if speaking a public truth in private. Of course, Celia had been confused lately. One must take such matters gently. Purbright noted how the attribution of confusion fell invariably on the absent. Miss Harcourt, already deceased, bore responsibility for what might otherwise have been a communal oversight. It was a convenient arrangement. The living preserved their reputations, and the dead assumed the uncertainty. He filed the observation silently, aware that the arithmetic of reputation often required an invisible ledger. Inside the council room, the minutes were being finalized with precise attention. Every motion was recorded, every apology accounted for, yet there was a discernible hesitancy in the phrasing. The words "legacy matters" remained neutral, but the tone conveyed a faint defensiveness, as if the council itself feared retrospective scrutiny. Purbright, who had witnessed many such exchanges, understood that the carefully calibrated language functioned as both shield and instruction. Shield for the past, instruction for the future. He observed a subtle interplay between those who spoke and those who corrected them, noting how even minor adjustments conveyed social hierarchy and moral hierarchy. Mrs. Ellsworth's earlier remark, repeated now with a slightly altered phrasing to a neighbour, suggested that communal memory was itself a contested space, policed by subtle cues rather than explicit censure. When the meeting finally adjourned, the councillors rose with relief, barely concealed, exchanging courteous nods that belied the quiet anxiety still circulating in the air. Outside, the evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of the parish garden, and Purbright walked with deliberate steps, reflecting on what he had witnessed. He considered the small but telling patterns, the attribution of confusion, the swift adjustments of language, the careful avoidance of certain questions. In this village, procedural order was inseparable from reputational management. Each motion, each correction, each polite cough reinforced the lattice of expectation. Yet amid the civility, Purbright discerned a subtle remainder, a gap that suggested arithmetic unresolved. The allocation of funds, the phrasing of motions, and the reassurance that all is well could not erase the faintly vexing question of intent. The council's assurances were persuasive, yet incomplete, leaving him with the impression that the underlying matter was neither settled nor ignorable. A small detail caught his eye. The chairman, adjusting his spectacles as he departed, paused at the doorway and cast a faint glance backward toward the empty chair that had belonged to Miss Harcourt. His expression was neutral, but there was a precise hesitation in the movement, a micro-gesture that suggested a consideration unspoken. Purbright noted it carefully. Even in a room defined by procedure and defended by civility, such gestures carried weight. They were the language of suspicion, of uncertainty, and perhaps of lingering conscience. As he walked toward the quiet square, illuminated by the lamps and the faint reflection from the church windows, Purbright reflected that the harmlessness of committees is rarely absolute. Beneath the calm exchange of motions and approvals, there existed subtle economies of blame and authority, delicate calculations that could alter reputations as surely as any scandal. And somewhere in those silent calculations, he sensed the faintest hint that a question, once asked, then muted, was beginning to press upon the order of things, awaiting the patience and observation that only he could provide. Inspector Purbright approached the village cluster of cottages with his usual punctuality, aware that in small towns the hour at which one calls can alter both reception and revelation. Doors opened with a ceremony bordering on performance, polished brass handles turned in unison, curtains drawn just so, and smiles extended in calibrated warmth. Every hostess greeted him as though his presence were an honor, yet each glance betrayed a subtle curiosity, an assessment, not of the inspector, but of what he might know and, crucially, of what he might infer. The first call was upon Mrs. Aldridge, whose china tea service was arranged with the precision of an accountant's ledger. "We were entirely ordinary, Inspector," she said, pouring tea as if ceremony could inoculate memory against impropriety. Nothing unusual occurred at all. She inclined her head to suggest that any further inquiry might be unnecessary. Purbright accepted the cup, noting the faintly chipped rim, which he thought lent her declaration an unintentional human touch. "I see," he said, lifting the porcelain lightly. "And yet you recall the afternoon, I trust?" "Entirely," Mrs. Aldridge replied. Then, hesitating, she added, "Though a cup was dropped, I believe. Or perhaps I'm mistaken. One's memory is not always perfectly reliable." Her eyes flicked toward the window, as though the air outside could be consulted for verification. The next house presented a contradiction. Mrs. Fenwick insisted that no cup had been displaced, that all china had remained upright, and that conversation had proceeded with customary civility. "A most ordinary gathering," she said, pressing her napkin against her knee with a formality that suggested both pride and defensive reassurance. Purbright made a mental note. When memory diverged so neatly, it often revealed more than it obscured. Discussion of the fatal question itself was treated with delicate evasions. In some recollections it appeared curious, a matter of legitimate inquiry regarding Miss Harcourt's recent revisions to charitable bequests. In others it became slightly rude, the product of imagined insolence. No one admitted to having posed it. Indeed, several hosts explained, with studied gentleness, why it would have been inappropriate to do so. Purbright, observing the rapidity with which moral judgments were applied to hypothetical behavior, noted how suspicion operated freely against unspoken acts, yet never touched those daring to imagine them. At Mrs. Hollingsworth's, a neighbour leaning in the doorway mentioned Miss Harcourt's niece, recently arrived from London. The name was pronounced carefully, as if to acknowledge relevance without endorsing familiarity. Then immediately the neighbour apologised, lowering her voice and correcting herself with a half-dozen deferential gestures. The apology, Purbright noted, extended far longer than the remark itself. In the village, even minor connections to scandal demanded ritual contrition, lest one's reputation be compromised by association. Purbright paused to observe the interiors, immaculate hearths, precisely folded napkins, vases arranged with rigid symmetry. Each domestic tableau seemed designed to channel recollection into approved channels, permitting memory only insofar as it did not disturb social equilibrium. The inspector, who had spent a career noting what was omitted as carefully as what was recited, found the architecture of omission most instructive. A brief visit to the widow of a distant parish committee member yielded another curious detail. She had attended the tea, she said, in order to maintain acquaintance with the fellowship. Yet her account of the conversation faltered precisely where the question had been asked. She insisted it was unremarkable, yet her hands fidgeted with the lace on her cuffs, betraying a nervous engagement with memory. "Perhaps someone... I do not recall," she began, then shook her head with an air of decisive finality. Purbright noted the pattern. The village preferred a nameless offender to a named truth, a diffuse culpability more manageable than any direct attribution. By late afternoon, Purbright had visited every attendee whose name had surfaced in the initial accounts. Each recollection was at once precise and elastic, details rearranged, events muted, contradictions tolerated, yet subtly observed. He found that civility served as both shield and sieve. It protected reputations while permitting the slow filtration of truth, leaving him to discern patterns from absences, hesitations, and gestures rather than direct statement. As he walked along the narrow lane toward the square, Purbright reflected on the subtle choreography he had observed. The repetition of corrected memory, the careful apologies, the exaggerated hospitality, all operated as a system of communal moral hygiene. The village's collective attention was trained less on facts than on propriety, and it was in that environment that questions, even fatal ones, exerted influence far beyond their utterance. A final observation struck him. At the very last cottage, Mrs. Tremaine paused by the door after seeing him out, her fingers lingering over the latch in a gesture that suggested both hesitation and calculation. She offered no word, but the pause carried significance, an acknowledgement that not all could or should be spoken aloud. Purbright filed it quietly in memory, as he had done with many minor signs. It was the faintest tremor in the otherwise placid routine, a subtle invitation for scrutiny if one were patient enough to follow it. By the time he returned to the main street, the sun had slanted low across the church tower, catching its windows with muted brilliance. Purbright walked on, aware that the question at the heart of the tea gathering had not been answered, yet its presence shaped behavior in ways more revealing than any direct confession. In the village, silence wielded authority equal to speech, and anonymous culpability was often preferable to transparent responsibility. The inspector, who had seen similar mechanisms in every parish of his acquaintance, sensed that a clue, quiet as a shadow, had emerged. A hesitation, a fidget, a gesture, one small point from which a larger truth might eventually be traced. Inspector Purbright collected the latest edition of the parish newsletter from the window ledge of the post office, noting with mild approval its punctuality and the subtle weight of printed paper that signified official communication. The small hall smelled faintly of ink and damp, an atmosphere that seemed to invest the bulletin with importance beyond its ordinary contents. He turned the pages deliberately, reading between the lines with the care one might reserve for delicate porcelain, aware that the omissions, often more revealing than the inclusions, were where the village's truths most comfortably resided. The front page announced the memorial service for Miss Celia Harcourt with courteous formality. The language was impeccable, celebrating her generosity and steadfast dedication to the parish, and praising the community for its collective contributions to her favourite causes. There was a paragraph on flowers to be laid in her memory, and a short note on refreshments to be served in the church hall. Every phrase was calibrated to convey harmony and proper sentiment. Yet what the newsletter did not include struck Purbright more forcibly as than any printed paragraph. There was no mention of Miss Harcourt's long tenure on the charity committee, no reference to her sudden resignation, and no acknowledgement of the minor controversies surrounding her last revisions to the will. Such matters, while perhaps awkward for the average reader, carried significance in understanding both her character and the subtle ripples her decisions had caused in the village. Purbright delivered the newsletter in person to Mrs. Fenwick, the editor, who received him with polite surprise, as though the inspector's visit lent gravity to routine correspondence. Tea was poured, biscuits arranged on a plate with careful attention to symmetry, and a discussion ensued that followed the conventional rhythms of civility. The omission of certain details, Purbright said gently. Was it due to editorial discretion? Mrs. Fenwick smiled, a small, deliberate gesture as if to signal both compliance and harmless deflection. Space constraints, Inspector. One must choose what can be included, she explained, glancing toward the gardening column, which ran to considerable excess. There's only so much room for roses and cabbages, even in the service of remembrance. He nodded, noting the faint humour, but detected a subtle tightness in her expression when mentioning Miss Harcourt's will. There was disagreement, was there not? He asked softly. Mrs. Fenwick's smile widened into something almost conspiratorial. Ah, yes, there was discussion, healthy, I would say, but entirely constructive. It would hardly be prudent to attribute it to any one individual. She sipped her tea, setting the cup down with the quiet authority of one accustomed to both conversation and omission. The committee's opinion is naturally collective. Everyone participated, and yet no one in particular. Purbright noted the skill with which she reframed potential controversy as communal decorum. The newsletter, he concluded, functioned less as record than as reassurance, a carefully constructed narrative designed to preserve reputations, mitigate anxiety, and avert reflection on inconvenient truths. After leaving, he returned to the empty office of the parish hall, where he had seen drafts stacked earlier. Among the discarded pages, he discovered an earlier draft of the newsletter in the wastebasket, its edges crumpled but legible. One sentence, apparently deleted at the editor's discretion, caught his attention. Questions raised at the tea regarding Miss Harcourt's charitable allocations remain unresolved. The deletion spoke louder than any printed line. It was a subtle act of self-censorship, a decision that converted fact into silence, transforming a social disturbance into a gentle non-event. Purbright observed the elegance of the omission. By erasing the sentence, the editor preserved the semblance of unity, while acknowledging, invisibly, that some questions refused to be fully absorbed into the communal narrative. Walking slowly along the village lanes, newsletter and discarded draft in hand, Purbright reflected on the architecture of silence he had observed. Words in print carried authority, yet their absence conveyed an equally deliberate form of persuasion. He considered how omission allowed the village to maintain its self-image, while the actual sequence of events, questions asked, minor disagreements, subtle tension over charitable bequests, remained preserved only in half-remembered glances, whispered recollections, and now in the inspector's careful record. At the churchyard, he paused beside a stone bench and examined the sunlight falling across the neatly trimmed grass. A light wind stirred, lifting petals from early flowering trees. The village's moral arithmetic, he realized, operated not in the audible assertions of propriety but in the gaps, the carefully edited silences, and the gestures left unremarked upon. The newsletter was both shield and signal, reassuring to the living but quietly revealing to those prepared to observe. As Purbright tucked the papers into his coat, he noticed a minor detail. The editor's signature on the final draft bore a slight imperfection, a small smudge of ink that had not been corrected. It was likely accidental, yet to Purbright, whose attention to minutiae was near compulsive, it suggested a momentary lapse, a trace of unease, or perhaps the faintest moral hesitation. In a village where every gesture was calibrated, such a slip could signify more than any overt statement. He continued toward the rectory, noting how the silence of the streets mirrored the editorial silences he had just examined. In St. Mildred's, propriety was not only maintained by etiquette and ritual, but by omissions, corrections, and subtle hierarchies of what could be spoken aloud. And somewhere amid the edited newsletters, the discarded drafts, and the invisible pressures of expectation, a question lingered, faint yet insistent. Who, ultimately, would bear responsibility for what was left unspoken? Margaret Lane arrived from London on a misty Thursday morning, alighting from the village omnibus with a manner both deliberate and measured, as though each step had been rehearsed to convey appropriate civility. She wore black, not the deepest mourning of a professional widow, but enough to suggest sorrow without spectacle. The driver, accustomed to her punctuality, inclined his head politely, noting her composure, as one might note the weather, with attentive observation rather than judgment. Purbright met her at the station, noting the careful restraint in her grief, expressed in minimal gestures and a polite modulation of voice. She spoke warmly of her aunt, praising her dedication to the church and the various charitable committees she had overseen. Yet, when the conversation turned to recent events, Margaret admitted, with a slight tightening of her lips, to certain differences of opinion regarding Miss Harcourt's philanthropic directions. The village, witnessing her arrival, treated Margaret with courteous suspicion. Housewives paused in their errands, exchanging glances that balanced civility with the measured wariness reserved for potential claimants. Councillors murmured greetings with a certain stiffness, as though each word might be catalogued for future reference. Purbright observed the subtle choreography. Smiles held just long enough to signal civility, heads inclined at precisely the correct angle to convey respect, eyes diverted quickly from any hint of confrontation. It emerged as conversation continued over carefully poured tea that Miss Harcourt had intended to redirect funds away from certain local causes, preferring, instead, to allocate resources to projects beyond the immediate purview of the parish. Margaret insisted she had not pressed her aunt on the matter, yet she acknowledged encouraging clarity regarding the distribution. In her phrasing, Purbright noted, there was an insistence on propriety, a deliberate avoidance of overstatement, but also a subtle insistence on rational explanation. Several villagers, speaking independently, echoed the same observation, always with careful politeness and faint regret. Mrs. Fenwick, the newsletter editor, suggested that Margaret's influence had been significant, though entirely understandable given the circumstances. The parish treasurer remarked, with a sigh that suggested both civility and resignation, that Margaret had clarified several misunderstandings without giving offence. Each account contained the same duality, acknowledgement of influence, paired with tacit reassurance that no wrongdoing had occurred. Purbright found the pattern instructive. Blame, he noted, was routinely outsourced to the outsider. The niece, conveniently absent at the ill-fated tea, became the repository for latent irritation and speculation. The village, having preserved its own decorum, could attribute disturbance to Margaret's rational interventions without implicating anyone who had been present. It was a clever, almost ritualized displacement, preserving both civility and hierarchy. As they spoke, Margaret produced a letter from her aunt, carefully folded, ink still faintly moist from the day before the tea. She handed it to Purbright with the exact formality one might employ when presenting a delicate instrument rather than a document of personal concern. Purbright unfolded it, noting the cursive script, deliberate, precise, and restrained. The letter expressed concern about being spoken for and requested that her intentions be respected. The phrasing struck Purbright immediately. It did not convey fear nor indecision, but a mild irritation, a subtle assertion of agency in circumstances where expectation might otherwise have overridden it. The letter, he realized, crystallized the tension between private intention and public assumption. In the village, irritation was harder to forgive than error. It suggested a refusal to conform to collective expectation, a gentle challenge to communal authority. Margaret, observing Purbright's examination of the letter, offered no explanation beyond its contents. She smiled faintly, almost apologetically, as if acknowledging the discomfort the missive might induce, without conceding fault. Purbright, who had long learned to read between politeness and phrasing, noted that the letter functioned as both evidence and statement. It preserved Miss Harcourt's autonomy while subtly highlighting the limitations imposed by social expectation. As the conversation concluded and Margaret prepared to retire to her lodgings, Purbright reflected on the social geometry he had observed. The village's routines, the measured greetings, the careful allocation of blame, the polite suspicions and formal niceties, functioned as a form of control, preserving equilibrium while leaving the question of agency unresolved. Margaret's presence had introduced a subtle perturbation, an external point around which gossip, judgment, and conjecture could orbit without overt confrontation. At the doorstep, she paused, offering Purbright a final courtesy in the form of a small, deliberate inclination of the head. The gesture was so slight as to be almost imperceptible, yet its precision conveyed both acknowledgement and a gentle assertion of independence. The inspector noted it carefully, a minute signal perhaps unnoticed by all others that suggested the presence of agency beyond communal orchestration. As he watched her recede along the lane, Purbright reflected that in St. Mildred's influence was most keenly felt when exercised quietly without announcement, and that reputational anxiety often masked the simplest truths. And somewhere in the muted tension of her visit, he sensed a subtle question emerging, one unspoken yet persistent. In a village that prized consensus and civility above clarity, who truly directed the flow of events, and to whose intentions should obedience or censure be accorded? By the time he returned to the vicarage, Inspector Purbright had gathered enough fragments, contradictions and hesitations to attempt what he had long avoided: the reconstruction of the question itself. It was, in its essence, astonishingly simple whether Miss Celia Harcourt intended to continue funding the refurbishment of the parish hall. Yet, as often happens in villages attentive to propriety, the simplicity of the inquiry belied the turbulence it had produced. Purbright assembled the recollections like pieces of a puzzle, each piece slightly warped by memory, by embarrassment, or by the subtle insistence to preserve reputation. Mrs. Aldridge recalled a moment of curiosity, Mrs. Fenwick a shade of perceived rudeness, and Mrs. Hollingsworth a faintly scandalized posture. No one admitted to posing the question. Indeed, several spoke at length about why it would have been improper to do so. Purbright reflected that offence often rests not in fact, but in the reminder of dependency. The inquiry, blunt and direct, had exposed the assumption that Miss Harcourt's generosity was both constant and unexamined. He discussed the matter with the vicar over afternoon tea, a practice that lent weight to observation while preserving civility. "I understand you have reconstructed the question," the vicar said, his voice careful, as though speaking about delicate glassware. "And it caused considerable disturbance?" "Disturbance, yes," Purbright replied, stirring his tea slowly. "Not because of the content, but because of the reminder it implied. It revealed entitlement where none was formally claimed." He watched the vicar's expression tighten ever so slightly, an involuntary acknowledgement of the subtle affront. "Ah," the vicar murmured, "harmony, one fears, is so easily disrupted." He paused, peering at the inspector through spectacles that seemed perpetually on the verge of slipping. "Even minor dislocations of expectation. They leave ripples, do they not?" "Indeed," Purbright said, lifting his cup. "And Miss Harcourt's death spared the village an explicit refusal, though her will confirms it indirectly. The effect is the same. Intention preserved, illusion of entitlement gently corrected." The vicar nodded, brushing an absent-minded finger along the lace edge of the tablecloth. "And yet the balance must be maintained. One cannot simply announce a withdrawal of support without unsettling the parish's sense of propriety." His voice implied no criticism, merely a factual acknowledgement that the preservation of social equilibrium was more pressing than clarity. Purbright considered the remark. In St. Mildred's, harmony required silence more than truth. Open discussion, even with civility, risked the exposure of assumptions that had long gone unexamined. A single question, though seemingly harmless, had already demonstrated its capacity to disturb the delicate lattice of expectation. He noted the patterns with care, the hesitations, the polite denials, the reliance on communal memory rather than individual testimony. Each fragment of conversation confirmed a single principle. Village etiquette demands that some matters remain unanswered, not because they lack answer, but because the answer would impose moral discomfort. Purbright spent the afternoon visiting those who had attended the tea, seeking corroboration. Each account, while consistent in essentials, varied in emphasis. Some remembered the tone as inquisitive, others as imperious. Some recalled glances exchanged, others only silence. All, however, agreed on the extraordinary civility maintained in Miss Harcourt's presence. She had neither chastised nor corrected the assumption. She allowed her autonomy to be both present and invisible, her intentions precise yet publicly unasserted. Returning to the vicarage, he unfolded his notes, comparing the recollections with the content of the letters, the newsletter, and the unsent communications. The question, he realized, functioned less as an inquiry than as a mirror. It reflected assumptions back upon those who had made them, revealing entitlement, expectation, and the discomfort that arises when autonomy is asserted. In this light, the offence was as much a product of self-recognition as of propriety. The vicar joined him by the window, gazing at the church tower as sunlight fell across its stonework. "I suppose, in a sense," the vicar said carefully, "the question was fatal only to illusion." "Precisely," Purbright replied. "Yet the village interprets it as disturbance, not insight. Harmony depends upon unspoken understanding more than actual agreement. The answer is less important than the maintenance of civility." The vicar sighed, folding his hands over a cup of cooling tea. "And so the investigation shifts," he said softly, "from who asked the question to why it could not be answered." Purbright nodded, noting the subtle shift. The matter was no longer about attribution, nor even intention. It concerned the mechanisms by which a community enforces silence, suppresses direct challenge, and polices its own expectations. He reflected on the faint but persistent signals he had collected, gestures, hesitations, the delicate corrections of memory. These, more than words, revealed the contours of authority and discomfort in the parish. As the afternoon waned, Purbright observed a minor detail. A page of the minutes set aside after the meeting bore a small notation in the margin, almost imperceptible, questioning whether the refurbishment funds had been taken for granted. It was unsigned, easily overlooked, yet in its quiet presence lay the first trace of dissent, the smallest crack in the village's carefully maintained illusion. The inspector set his cup down with precision, feeling that the day's work had brought him closer to the heart of the disturbance. One question, he reflected, need not be answered to exert influence. In St. Mildred's, as elsewhere, the subtlety of inquiry often outlasted explicit speech, and the silent recognition of dependence could unsettle civility more decisively than any overt dispute. And somewhere amid the tea-stained lace, the polite affirmations, and the carefully curated recollections, Purbright noted the faintest whisper of a further clue. A hesitation in a remembered glance, a correction of emphasis, a trace that suggested the village's equilibrium was, perhaps, only temporarily restored. The revelation of authorship arrived quietly, without fanfare, during a brief visit to the village hall. Inspector Purbright had summoned Mrs. Elspeth Crowley, the treasurer of the Ladies' Fellowship, under the pretext of clarifying committee procedures. She appeared with the composed bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility, her hair pinned with geometric precision, her dress neat but unobtrusive. Nothing about her posture suggested confession, all the more telling, perhaps, that it would come. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head with faint formality, "I imagine you have some questions regarding the tea gathering." Purbright, seated behind a plain oak table, produced a notebook and regarded her with his customary calm. "I am interested in understanding the sequence of events," he said, "and in particular the moment we have discussed, the question concerning Miss Harcourt's charitable intentions." Mrs. Crowley nodded, folding her hands over a small purse. "Very well, I asked it," she said, her tone even, measured, almost scholarly in its detachment. "I believed transparency preferable to unspoken speculation. There was no intent to disrupt, nor to offend, only to clarify the parish's understanding." Purbright observed the subtle composure in her delivery. She was known among the fellowship for tact, for precision, for the quiet management of accounts and expectations. Yet he could see now that her position within the committee had shifted since the tea. Glances, once neutral, now carried faint suspicion. The smallest corrections of her phrasing in meetings had become more frequent. Others had described her as under strain, a polite euphemism which Purbright reflected converts integrity into instability with astonishing efficiency. "I assure you, Inspector," she continued, "I intended no challenge to anyone's judgment, merely clarification. The parish had assumed continuation. I sought confirmation, that is all." Purbright made a careful note. The language was precise, the intention unambiguous, yet he could already anticipate the silent interpretation. A question, posed with civility, recast in collective memory as disruption. He set down his pen and regarded her quietly. "And the village's reaction?" he asked softly. Mrs. Crowley's eyes, which had been composed, softened ever so slightly. "It revealed more than the question," she admitted. "The disquiet was not about what I asked, but about what it reminded them that their assumptions were not mandates, that generosity has limits, that Miss Harcourt's will need not align with expectation, that the comfort of the familiar may be challenged even politely." Purbright inclined his head. He had spent a career observing such mechanics. Honesty, even mild, invariably disrupts a comfortable fiction. The village, so devoted to harmony and propriety, had absorbed her question as a tremor in its meticulously balanced equilibrium. Yet no formal charges were considered. None could be. The damage had already been allocated, diffused through polite remarks, amended minutes, and unspoken judgments. "Do you believe, then," Purbright asked, "that your position requires reconsideration?" Mrs. Crowley hesitated, fingering the clasp of her purse. "I have wondered if resignation might restore calm," she admitted. "Yet I am not convinced it would. Perhaps the village requires the maintenance of appearance more than the removal of perceived disturbance." Purbright made no reply. Silence in this instance was itself a response, the closest he could come to intervention without altering the equilibrium he observed. He allowed her pause to expand as she wished, understanding that in small communities agency is rarely exercised directly. It flows subtly through suggestion, observation, and the careful management of expectation. After a few moments, Mrs. Crowley straightened, her expression returning to formal composure. "You will, I imagine, understand why I could not remain silent," she said. "Politeness has its limits, Inspector, even in St. Mildred's." "I understand entirely," Purbright replied, folding his notebook and placing it aside. "Your honesty, though disruptive, has clarified the underlying dynamics more than any rumor or speculation ever could." He paused, noting her small nod, the faint adjustment of her posture, the almost imperceptible exhalation that suggested relief without surrender. As he left the village hall, he reflected on the subtle mechanisms he had observed. Mrs. Crowley's question had not been fatal in content, nor had it been scandalous in delivery. Its impact lay in exposing latent assumption, in reminding the village of the contingency of generosity, and in demonstrating that civility, while highly prized, could not entirely suppress reality. The social ledger had already recorded the disturbance, discreetly assigning responsibility to the absent, the overextended, and, in this instance, to no one in particular. Walking along the narrow lane toward the vicarage, Purbright considered the economy of silence and subtle correction he had witnessed. The village required neither accusation nor punishment, the reallocation of discomfort, the polite reclassification of intention sufficed to restore equilibrium. Integrity, when expressed, becomes liable to reinterpretation. Civility, when enforced, exerts authority beyond argument. A minor detail drew his attention. As he passed the committee notice board, a small scrap of paper pinned slightly askew bore the faint heading, clarifications pending. It was unsigned, unnoticed, by casual glance, yet its presence echoed the dynamics he had just observed, a public record, minimal yet persistent, reminding that even the politest of inquiries leaves traces, however faint. Purbright made a mental note. Mrs. Crowley had emerged as the polite culprit, but her culpability was neither condemned nor punished. It existed quietly within the subtle oscillations of reputation and expectation. The village's equilibrium was maintained, though now informed by a small, indelible perturbation. The recognition that even civility could challenge consensus, and that the question, though asked politely, had already shifted the shape of authority and perception. By the second week following the tea gathering, Inspector Purbright found himself delivering reports in the manner most suitable to St. Mildred's, quietly, orally, and with an emphasis on propriety rather than procedure. He spoke to the vicar, to the committee secretary, and, in passing to a few councillors, always framing events in terms of social consequence rather than legal concern. "No crime has been committed," he remarked over tea in the rectory. "No malice intended, only a community startled by its own assumptions." His words were received with polite murmurs of agreement, their simplicity belying the subtle relief they carried. Miss Harcourt's death remained, as the coroner had recorded, entirely natural, and no evidence suggested otherwise. Yet the social consequences had been considerable. The parish council, having noted both the disruption and the opportunity, reinstated its consensus with minor adjustments. The wording of minutes was refined, motions phrased more precisely, and the allocation of charitable funds clarified for the future. The adjustments, though trivial in scope, satisfied the village's need to demonstrate control, to assert that civility and correctness had been preserved despite minor perturbations. Mrs. Elspeth Crowley, whose question had precipitated the disturbance, was formally thanked for her past service. The phrasing was careful, for many years of devoted oversight rather than a contemporary acknowledgement. Her attendance at meetings would continue, nominally, but her influence had been quietly moderated. The polite suggestion that she might step aside, previously whispered and unspoken, had already taken effect in subtle shifts. Glances redirected, corrections of phrasing applied without comment, and the occasional gentle preemption of her proposals. Integrity had been preserved in form, but reclassified in function. Margaret Lane returned to London shortly thereafter, her inheritance intact, her aunt's estate settled in accordance with the last will. She bore the village's polite ambivalence lightly, expressing only mild regret for the minor confusion she had caused, and yet Purbright noted a faint edge in the greetings she received, approval mingled with cautious suspicion. The inheritance, though lawfully hers, remained socially unwelcome, a subtle testament to the village's preference for expectation over entitlement. The vicar, meanwhile, preached as usual, his sermons suffused with gentle exhortations to discretion, propriety, and the care of one's neighbour. He refrained from applying these principles to current events, leaving the congregation to infer their relevance, or not. Purbright observed that the skillful deployment of abstract virtue often suffices where explicit admonition might unsettle equilibrium. The parish listened attentively, some heads nodding, others not, and life proceeded under the cover of normalcy, the social ledger quietly balanced. In reviewing his notes, Purbright noted how reputations had been redistributed, like furniture in a hall, quietly, efficiently, and without discussion. Mrs. Crowley's influence had been curtailed, Margaret's inheritance acknowledged yet subtly marginalized, and Miss Harcourt's intentions respected, albeit at a distance. Each participant had adjusted posture, phrasing, and attention to suit the restored order. The fatal question, the simple inquiry regarding charitable continuation, was never asked again. Its answer, however, governed future decisions silently, an invisible force shaping allocations, expectations, and the careful choreography of conversation. Purbright spent a final afternoon visiting several of the committee members, noting the habitual corrections and small differences that had emerged since the disruption. Conversations were more circumspect, gestures slightly more formal, and glances more carefully moderated. It was clear that the social economy of St. Mildred's had absorbed the shock, redistributing unease where it would do the least harm, converting potential conflict into subtle conformity. The inspector reflected, as he often did, on the peculiar mechanics of small communities: guilt without accountability, discomfort without confession, and disruption without sanction. In St. Mildred's, the village preferred the appearance of propriety over the actuality of resolution, maintaining equilibrium at the expense of transparency. Politeness, silence, and carefully allocated recognition sufficed to stabilize the social ledger, and for the participants, this constituted justice. On his last visit, as he prepared to leave the village, Purbright paused at the edge of the square, where sunlight fell across the churchyard and the familiar lanes wound toward cottages polished by routine. He observed a minor detail: a small scrap of the newsletter pinned to the community board, a paragraph celebrating unity and collective effort. It contained no reference to the recent events, no hint of questions raised, no acknowledgement of disruption. Yet Purbright noted that the omission itself was eloquent, a reminder that in St. Mildred's the balance of civility often outweighed the documentation of fact. With his coat buttoned and notebook tucked securely beneath his arm, he turned toward the omnibus. The village remained outwardly composed, its streets quiet, its moral hierarchy intact. The case, in the traditional sense, had concluded not with resolution, but with restored appearances. The fatal question, unasked but influential, persisted as a silent governor of future conduct. Purbright reflected that in St. Mildred's, as elsewhere, the social system preferred to allocate guilt, discomfort, and consequence without requiring accountability. In this quiet redistribution, civility reigned supreme, and the inspector, satisfied yet contemplative, departed with the knowledge that the equilibrium he had observed would endure until, inevitably, the next small perturbation arose. Weeks had passed since the subtle upheaval of Miss Harcourt's final days, and the ladies' fellowship gathered once more in the village hall, as though nothing had occurred beyond the habitual cycle of tea, biscuits, and conversation. The long table, polished and cloth-covered, bore china arranged with familiar precision, cups aligned to the millimetre, spoons reflecting the soft afternoon light. A new treasurer poured the tea, her movements observed with careful scrutiny by several long-standing members. Politeness here had become both instruction and instrument. Miss Harcourt's portrait hung above the mantel, a testament to her influence and enduring presence. Her expression was serene, her eyes cast as if forgiving, and her smile, interpreted generously by the fellowship, lent warmth without intrusion. Discussion flowed easily around horticulture, church flowers, and the parish bazaar. Not a word passed regarding finance, bequests, or charitable intent. The careful avoidance of delicate subjects was as deliberate as the placement of sugar cubes, a social strategy perfected over decades. Purbright, invited as a courtesy, declined to enter. He lingered outside in the narrow corridor, observing through the doorway as cups were filled and conversations conducted with gentle ritual. The village, he noted, had learned which questions were permissible and which, though tempting, must remain unspoken. Civility now functioned as control, a mechanism both protective and disciplinary. The visible order preserved, the invisible tensions diffused. Within the hall, Mrs. Crowley, past treasurer, attended as a member rather than an authority, her movements careful, her expressions courteous, but slightly restrained. She poured no tea, suggested no alterations, and spoke only when necessary. The subtle redistribution of influence was complete. Her integrity, once a source of minor disturbance, now subsisted quietly, acknowledged in form but moderated in function. Observers detected nothing amiss, though Purbright could read the slight stiffness in her gestures, the micro-pauses that signalled her awareness of the invisible ledger of civility. The fellowship's attention turned to the new treasurer, who poured with a measured deliberation that seemed to reassure the congregation. Each smile she offered was mirrored, each gesture attended to with communal approval. The village, Purbright reflected, possessed a delicate pedagogy of civility. Teach the newcomer the rhythms of expectation, and the equilibrium restores itself, sometimes even before the first cup is emptied. Outside, Purbright leaned against the doorframe, notebook in hand, but unused. The village had reverted to its accustomed pattern, yet he observed with quiet satisfaction the subtle lines of influence and control. The unspoken rules governed action as effectively as any regulation. Questions regarding charitable funds remained dormant, assumptions reinforced, and minor perturbations absorbed without comment. The mechanisms of order were not punitive, they were anticipatory, preventive, almost architectural in their design. Through the window, he watched sunlight scatter across the polished wooden floor, falling upon china and cloth alike. Conversation continued, punctuated by polite laughter and gentle corrections of memory, each remark calibrated to maintain cohesion. No one referred to the fatal question, though its presence lingered as an invisible horizon, shaping behavior, influencing allocation of attention, determining the rhythm of exchange. Purbright understood that the answer, while never spoken, had already become governing principle. The kettle whistled, a soft and unobtrusive signal, yet no one paused to ask what it might signify beyond the preparation of tea. The unspoken rule prevailed. Civility, when enforced meticulously, suffices to suppress curiosity, to regulate memory, and to redistribute tension. The village had mastered the delicate balance between acknowledgement and avoidance, maintaining propriety while leaving private intentions undisturbed, at least until a future disruption might occur. Purbright reflected upon the economy of silence in St. Mildred's, the subtle calibration of speech, the careful corrections, and the understated acknowledgments that signaled both respect and limitation. He noted the elegance of omission as a social instrument. Entire questions, even those of practical consequence, could be rendered irrelevant through the collective decision to leave them unasked. In this sense, the case was closed, if not resolved in spirit. A minor detail caught his attention, a small paper note affixed to the inside of the hall notice board, almost hidden by a pressed flower and listing volunteer duties for the upcoming bazaar. Its placement, so unobtrusive, suggested an awareness of continuity rather than disruption. Nothing controversial appeared, yet the marginal presence hinted that small signals, minor records, could exist without challenging the cultivated silence. It was a subtle reminder that equilibrium, while resilient, remained watchful. As Purbright turned to leave the hall, he observed a fleeting gesture from Mrs. Fenwick, the newsletter editor. A slight lifting of the eyebrows toward a comment on flower arrangements, a silent recognition of shared memory, and then immediate restoration of decorum. These micro-signals, trivial to casual observation, conveyed the persistent undercurrent of social awareness. The village remembered even when speech forbade acknowledgement. Stepping into the street, Purbright reflected on the lessons of civility as control, on how silence and omission shaped behavior more effectively than admonition or confrontation. The case, he noted, concluded not with resolution, but with restored appearances. The fatal question remained unasked, the answer unspoken, yet its governance endured invisibly, shaping allocation, attention, and expectation. In St. Mildred's, as elsewhere, disruption is rarely punished. It is simply absorbed, redistributed, and remembered in subtle, disciplined ways. And somewhere, in the low hum of conversation, in the precise alignment of china, and in the gentle gestures of approval and correction, Purbright suspected that the silence would last exactly until the next polite disruption, when, as always, civility would reveal its power to govern, restrain, and reshape, quietly, elegantly, and without spectacle.